Welcome everyone to the Tropical Topics Week put on by your local National Weather Service offices in Florida and the National Hurricane Center. My name is Daniel Noah. I am the Warning Coordination Meteorologist at the National Weather Service Tampa Bay, located in Ruskin, Florida. Jessica Few is my cohort in doing the logistics of this training. She's a lead forecaster with a focus on tropical weather at the National Weather Service in Tallahassee. Due to the large number of participants, and we do expect about 600 people on today's training, please type your questions into the question box and they will be answered at the end of the training session. Some may actually be answered with text during the session. This presentation is being recorded and will be made available on the registration website next Monday. The Q&A portion of today's training will not be recorded. Training certificates will be available about 1 hour after this training ends. The email that you will receive has a link at the bottom of it, and when you click it, it might take a minute or two to run. You may get this rotating circle, and it may take a couple minutes, but it does eventually show up. And also on that email, you will receive the link to where you can view the recordings and even download some of the PDFs of the trainings from this week. With that, I am going to introduce my counterpart at the National Weather Service in Jacksonville. His name is Al Sandrick. He is the Warning Coordination Meteorologist for the Jacksonville area. Go ahead, Al.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. As Dan said, I am the Warning Coordination Meteorologist in Jacksonville, but we're doing this presentation for the entire state. And Florida has one of the largest coastlines in the United States. And I really like to thank all of our Florida core partners who have gotten onto this call, but we know there are people from other areas. And what I'd like to say to you is we've got a lot in common with other areas. With the long coastline that we have, we mimic just about every type of storm surge environment that there is in the United States, with the possible exception of the Rocky Coast in Maine. So what you should be thinking as you're looking at Northwest Florida or the Tampa Bay area is, what do I have in common in my area with what's being discussed right now? So what we're going to do is we're going to start in the northwest part of the state, and we're going to go around the Florida Big Bend and the Florida Peninsula, and then back up the East Coast, with one exception. We are going to leave the best for last, and that's going to be the Florida Keys. So with that, I would like to say also, do pay attention to the different types of storm surge environments that each of our forecasters and warning coordination meteorologists describes to you, and also how wave action impacts those particular areas. So I'm going to pass it over to Jason Beeman, who is the warning coordination meteorologist from the Mobile office.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. When you're looking at the Northwest Florida, the area that the National Weather Service Mobile covers from Biscayne County, Santa Rosa County, Okaloosa County, it's really noted by a coastline that has a very sharp elevation rise. And so for a large part of the area, it's really the barrier islands that are taking the brunt of the storm surge. For Perdido Key, Pensacola Beach, Okaloosa Island, for example. And really, in that regard, they take the brunt of it. When you go into the inland bays, though, Perdido Bay, Escambia Bay, East Bay, especially the north ends of those bays, that's really where you get into the river valleys, the more shallow sloping of the coastline, to where you get a greater inundation, including areas around Garcon Point there, between East Bay and Pensacola Bay. And we saw this really in Sally last year, how much the inland bays were impacted with the surge, of course, along with the barrier islands. So if we go to the next slide, we'll take a look at what are some of the top surge events that's happened in Northwest Florida. And we'll take a look at Pensacola, Florida, because we have a long period of record there of high water marks and tide gauge readings. And it should be no surprise to most of you that Hurricane Ivan tops that list with just under 10 feet of an inundation, storm surge inundation from Hurricane Ivan, followed right along from the 1926 Miami hurricane of over 7 feet. But look what's third. Recent memory, last year, Hurricane Sally, at just over 5.5 feet of storm surge at the port of Pensacola. And it was obviously higher in certain spots, up to 7 feet of inundation in parts of those bays that we were talking about, Perdido, north end of Perdido Bay, Escambia Bay, East Bay, especially the Blackwater River areas there, really saw a very high storm surge with Sally. And it's really interesting if you compare Ivan and Sally, as the next slide will show, kind of a fascinating case of how same location, almost same size of storm, but obviously big differences, big variables that resulted in different surge outcomes. So what's really interesting about Ivan and Sally is that they made landfall on the exact same day, 16 years apart, September 16th in the early morning hours, in the exact same location. Gulf Shores, Alabama is where the I made landfall, which put all of Northwest Florida side that saw the highest storm surge. Now, obviously, there were differences. Landfall of Ivan was more intense, 120 miles an hour, lower pressure, but it was weakening at landfall. Sally was just the opposite. The peak intensity was a little lower at 110 miles an hour, pressure a little higher, but it was rapidly intensifying at landfall. Another difference, Ivan, a very fast moving storm. It was in and out in a matter of a few hours. Sally took what seemed like forever to move out of the area, sometimes moving stationary or moving only at 2 miles per hour. So if we go to the next slide, we can see kind of the differences in impacts. With Ivan, Ivan was a strong Category 4 hurricane out in the Gulf of Mexico. It moved from south to north across the entire fetch of the Gulf of Mexico. It had a large time to push a lot of water from the Gulf of Mexico to those Gulf-facing shores. So the Gulf-facing shores during Ivan were impacted significantly with 10 to 15 feet of storm surge, even along Gulf-facing shores from Pensacola to Destin. If you look at Sally, Sally really wasn't a Gulf side threat. It did not have that fetch of water, that intensity and that duration to really push the large envelope of water to necessarily the Gulf-facing shores. It was the inland bays, the constant piling of water in the inland bays, along with the heavy rainfall that had kind of exacerbated the entire situation, that really resulted in a devastating surge of 5 to 7 feet over those inland bays, like I talked about, North Perdido Bay, Escambia Bay, East Bay, up the Blackwater River. So it's very interesting to note that we had two similar sized storms in the exact same location, but so many other variables come into play to result in very different results when it comes to storm surge, and shows the complexities of storm surge, not only in our area, but in general. The next slide, something to really consider in Northwest Florida is we have deeper water that comes closer to the coast than, say, areas just to the west over coastal Alabama, or just to the east over as you get to Apalachee Bay. So that deeper water coming closer to the shore really allows larger breaking waves to come closer to shore, that can result in wave run up, that can result in flooding of barrier islands prior to the arrival of the main surge. But also the large waves themselves can cause damage to the barrier islands. So that's something that's that's unique to our part of the coast in Northwest Florida. You get higher surf heights, higher wave action that can really compound things and produce an onset of flooding even prior to the main arrival of surge. So that's a little bit about the Northwest Florida area. I will pass it over now to our colleagues in Weather Service Tallahassee.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kelly Gotze. I'm the Senior Service Hydrologist and Meteorologist at the National Weather Service office in Tallahassee. I want to talk to you a little bit about the diversity of surge that we see in the eastern Florida Panhandle and then into Apalachee Bay. As Jason was just showing, the bathymetry across the northern Gulf of Mexico really changes considerably once you approach Apalachicola and then move eastward. I have highlighted on there the 33-foot water depth or 10-meter depth line, and you can see how close it is to the coast at Panama City. But as you go further eastward into Apalachee Bay, it's well offshore, and that shallow sloping coastline of Apalachee Bay will make that area one of the most surge-prone areas in the entire United States. That shape of the coastline and the shallow shelf waters really lead to a piling up of water that can spread many, many miles inland and be incredibly deep under the right conditions, depending on storm track, storm size, and intensity. And of course, this is going to vary considerably with what we see over in the eastern panhandle near Panama City. On the next slide, we've got an animation that's going to play here shortly that really contrasts the two different types of surge that we see in the Tallahassee area of responsibility. The image on the left is more typical of what we see around Panama City, where we have a lot of wave action that can build up. We can get significant surges, and of course, we saw that during Hurricane Michael. But the likelihood of surge that extends many, many miles inland is quite different than what we would see over in Apalachee Bay. And as you can see in this animation on the right, water will continue to pile up, spread many miles inland, and some wave action on top of that can be very destructive to structures along the coast and inundating entire communities that are near the immediate coast and even 5 to 10 miles inland. A great depiction of that is on our next slide, which shows a Category 3 maximum slosh depiction from our western CWA over near Destin, all the way over to the Suwannee River on the eastern side. And you'll notice very quickly that the characteristic, not only in terms of water depth at the coast, but also inland extent of surge, varies greatly from one side to the other. And of course, you know, Hurricane Michael produced a 14-foot storm surge into Mexico Beach, and that's in the Florida Panhandle. So certainly our areas along the Florida Panhandle coast do get significant and life-threatening surges, and the wave action on top of those can be especially destructive. In Apalachee Bay, when we look at storms like Hurricane Dennis in 2005, we saw a surge that went many miles inland at the head of Apalachee Bay into St. Mark's and even further inland. We've seen other events that produce surge that go more than 5 miles from the coast as you head down the southeast Florida Big Bend coast into Taylor and Dixie counties. The thing that I often note for folks is the magnitude of these surges. Look at how in Apalachee Bay, the total inundation is almost double that, and in some cases triple of what we might see in the Florida Panhandle. What's important to note is that Apalachee Bay is very sensitive to track intensity and the size of the tropical cyclone. Subtle shifts in track can make all the difference between what we see in terms of magnitude of surges in Apalachee Bay. So this creates some communication challenges for us to the emergency management community and to the public when we have a storm that still may be 3 to 5 days from landfall. The vulnerability of Apalachee Bay makes it one of the more challenging areas to cover in the United States just because of this surge vulnerability. So that's some insight into the surge that we see in the Florida Panhandle and Florida Big Bend. I'll go ahead and hand it off to our office down the west coast of Florida in Tampa.
Okay, all right, here we go. Sorry about that. So we are, this is Jen Hubbard, hi. We have the #1 and #2 most difficult hurricane evacuation areas in the US. So that is one of our biggest hurdles on the west, central and southwest Florida Gulf coasts. With that though, we know that your decision timeframe far exceeds our watch warning timeframe. So just know that we are working very hard to make sure we get the best data to you to help you make those decisions, even though it's outside our typical watch timeframe. Next slide, please. So we're going to take a look at those coastlines for us. Instead of the maximum envelope of water, I used just for a Cat 2, and that was to highlight, you can still see where we have vulnerabilities, but I wanted to highlight the fact that just with a Cat 2, not even a major hurricane, we can still see some catastrophic, potentially storm surge happen with these. So it doesn't take a major hurricane to potentially cause some catastrophic damage along our coastlines. But where we have our barrier islands in place in Pinellas, Manatee, and Sarasota counties, we see that those barrier islands, again, take the brunt of the surge. However, once we get into Charlotte Harbor and Tampa Bay there, that water just piles right up into those waterways, and we see the surge push well inland all along the coastline within those, the bay and the harbor there. And rivers extend into those. You see the water pile up into those rivers well inland from that as well. Next slide. As we move north along our coastline, then we get into our nature coast area, which has, similar to Apalachee Bay, that very shallow shelf line. And so we see the super high surge values pushing well inland in those locations. So Our main takeaway from these three maps is to show that while every storm is unique, we have these vulnerable areas, and it does not take a major hurricane to cause major damage when it relates to surge. And though our barrier islands do take a huge brunt of the surge where they exist, do also consider the fact that new passes may be carved into these islands with a stronger storm system moving over them. This is how we got John's Pass and Hurricane Pass, as well as Honeymoon Island with previous storms. It also occurred during Hurricane Charlie down in Southwest Florida. So it's happened before, it will happen again. Also, small changes in the storm track can cause major changes in where the strongest storm surge occurs. But once we get into the watch warning timeframe, we do have our probabilistic forecasts that we use, and they account for those variances. So you might see a big change in the forecast for the storm itself, but our surge forecasts probably won't have too much of a change. And it's because it has those variances accounted for in it. And the good news with this season is that those probabilistic forecasts are going to be extended out to 60 hours in some cases. Next slide. So now we're going to take a look back at Tropical Storm Eta from last year, and this is at the point when it was doing its little loop-de-loop in the Gulf and then traveling northeast along our entire coastline before eventually making landfall in Cedar Key. Now, it caused storm surge of 2 to 4 feet along our entire coastline as it's made its way up into Cedar Key. And with just 2 to 4 feet of storm surge, it caused over $50 million in damages, and we did have a couple of fatalities as well that occurred from the surge. I use this as an example to highlight the fact that a lot of times for West Central Southwest Florida, we will see storm systems that develop in the Gulf and then lift out to the northeast. And oftentimes they will not impact us in any other way, but we will still see storm surge occur from those storms, instead making landfall maybe in the Panhandle area or something like that. We also get a lot of systems that will move from the Atlantic into the Gulf and then start to turn northward, paralleling our coastline. And in those instances as well, we will often see no other impacts from the system, except we will see the storm surge occur. So something to keep in mind, even though we might not be under any type of other tropical watches or warnings, you might still see some surge impacts. Next slide. And here is just a look at what the 2 to 4 feet of storm surge looked like with quote unquote just a tropical storm. So it does make a big impact there. And that's all I have. Thank you very much. Going down to Miami.
All right, thanks, Jen. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Robert Moyeda with the National Weather Service office in Miami, South Florida. So we're working our way down the Gulf Coast, and you've seen this map already shown in different ways. If you advance, if you go to the next animation, you'll get a zoomed in view of the southern part of the Florida Peninsula. So we can talk a little bit more about the unique aspects of the coastline and the bathymetry offshore. As has been noted already by Jason, Kelly, and Jen, we have a pretty wide shelf along or off the Gulf Coast. So the National Weather Service Miami, our service area, covers both the Atlantic coast and the Gulf Coast. So we're unique in that aspect, at least in the peninsula, is that we cover both the Atlantic and Gulf Coast. So we're dealing with two vastly different surge setups. So on the Gulf side, very wide shelf, so shallow water farther offshore, that of course, as you've heard already, enhances or can increase the surge potential as that surge moves right along the coast, and it can penetrate farther inland as well. Now, as you work your way around to the East Coast, then we start getting into a totally different situation where we have a very narrow continental shelf. So the water depth decreases rapidly, just a few miles offshore. If I'm not mistaken, that yellow, the edge of the yellow contour, the yellow coloring there, that's like the 500-foot depth line. And that's just a couple of miles offshore, literally, once you get to off, the Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach area. So the very narrow shelf that'll tend to produce lower surge values, however, larger waves. So it is somewhat counteracted. There is one notable and important exception to the setup on the Atlantic coast, and that's Biscayne Bay. Now, Biscayne Bay is basically from downtown Miami southward, extending to just off of Homestead and borders the upper Florida Keys. That's a very shallow body of water, basically right next to the drop off of the continental shelf. So that presents a surge that really similar in some ways, at least, to what you could see along the Gulf Coast, just in a very limited area. All right, you go to the next slide, please. So kind of summing it up as far as the MOM, or the worst case scenario for certain categories, this is the category 1 MOM, or the maximum of the meows. And you can see that the difference being along the Gulf Coast, not only do you have higher values, but you have values that can, or higher surge that can penetrate inland, or farther inland. In some cases, up to 5 miles, or even more down once you get down into the mangroves of mainland Monroe County. Once you go over to the East Coast there, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach areas, it's much more limited, except right along the southern Biscayne Bay shoreline. So we advance to the next animation, or next slide there, that'll be a category 3. And of course, you'll see an increase, and most notable in the high and already in our surge vulnerable areas, where you have a large area of potentially, greater than 9 feet above ground level, extending pretty far inland along the southwest Florida Gulf Coast, and even a little bit there in southern Biscayne Bay. So advance to the next one, which is category 5, pretty much your worst case scenario. You can see that how far inland potentially the high surge values could get along, in Southwest Florida, and you could even start to see some higher values show up even along the East Coast. But notice there the big difference in not only in the values, in the inundation values that are depicted in the MOMs, but how far inland they spread, and the big difference between a very narrow area, relatively speaking, along the Atlantic coast, and a very far potential inland penetration along the Gulf Coast. All right, next slide, please. So we'll take a look at, as an example, a more recent example, Hurricane Irma from back in September of 2017, as an example of some of these widely varying surge impacts that we experienced here in the southern Florida peninsula. Irma, you see the inset there on the left map. The center as a category made landfall first in the lower Florida Keys, then made landfall on the Florida mainland right near Marco Island as a category 3, and then pretty much moved straight north. The map on the right shows the storm surge warnings that were in effect leading up to the landfall of Hurricane Irma. They included all of the Gulf Coast around the Florida Bay shoreline, and then Miami-Dade County on the East Coast. Notice that there was a part of the East coastline there, the coastline of the Atlantic coast, that was not in the surge warning, and those are the coastlines of Broward and Palm Beach counties. And if you go to the next slide, we'll start talking more about some of the more specific values that we had with Irma. So these were peak storm surge values. These were based on a lot of surveys that we did, as well as some of the gauges across the area. The yellows along the East Coast are basically showing values somewhere in a range of in excess of 3 feet. In some cases, they were pretty close to 6 feet as a maximum. And that extended about as far north as the Fort Lauderdale area, right around 3 feet in the Fort Lauderdale area, maybe closer to 4, 5, 6 feet in a few spots south of Miami along the Biscayne Bay shoreline. Now, on the Gulf Coast, that's where the peak values occurred. That's where we had values as high as 8 to 10 feet down in Everglades City, and then getting fairly close to Marco Island, not quite all the way to Naples area, values that were around 6 feet. But once we got to the Gulf Coast from Marco Island, Naples northward, values dropped off quite a bit, maybe up to about 3 feet or so in some areas. Next slide, please. We'll see on the right side there. This was from the advisory about 48 hours before landfall. this is what the probabilistic surge, or the P surge, was calling for, or what was showing. And again, you see that very those high potential values there along the Gulf Coast, and also wrapping around the East Coast into the Biscayne Bay shoreline, but a rapid decrease as you went northward along the East Coast. So this P surge forecast from about 48 hours out verified pretty well in the Everglades City area. So again, that's where the highest surge was, about 8 to 10 feet. And it probably verified well farther south in mainland Monroe County. We just didn't have any survey points or data points to really assess there, but probably some high values down in that area as well. Next slide, please. So yeah, and this is that from that same forecast that the P surge graphic was from, showing you what the forecast track at that time was. So the forecast track had the center of Irma making landfall just east of Marco Island as a category 4. So it actually made landfall just a hair to the west as a category 3. So these minor differences, and you've already heard it before, make a pretty big difference. So if you go to our next slide, which will be our final slide, we'll talk about these minor differences and what the big challenges that they pose to forecasters. This is again from Irma. The slide the graphic on the left is the actual track that it took. So you can see it made landfall near Marco Island, the highest surge values to the east. Now, about 24 hours before, the previous day, the forecast track had it going about 30 miles to the west, or just offshore Naples. Notice the dramatic difference in the surge values in the Naples area where the highest population is. So we're talking, if the forecast track from 24 hours before would have verified, potentially 200,000 people or so with greater than 3 feet of storm surge inundation. That's how different the impacts were or could have been had the track just been just very, very slightly to the west. Okay, advance to the next animation, please. We got just 2 more of these to go. Now, the thing that we dealt with and ended up dealing with due to the track of the storm was, since it passed just to the east of Naples, we had and this happened further up along the Gulf Coast as well, is that we had a lot of water ahead of the storm. The wind flow was out of the northeast, so blowing offshore. So we actually had a very dramatic reduction or lowering of the water values. So like a negative surge, I guess you could say. And the image in the top right, that's a hydrograph from the USGS on the US 41 bridge over the Gordon River to the northern end of Naples Bay, just east of downtown Naples. It showed a very rapid decrease, but then as the storm made landfall and it moved just to the east, of the center, the eye moved just east of Naples, the wind switched to onshore or out of the southwest and west and brought all that water back up, funneling it up Naples Bay. And you can see that increase, which was about 8 feet in just over 9 hours, a very dramatic increase, really about 4 feet. About the rate was about 3 feet per hour at that gauge. And we were so concerned about that because we saw, we're anticipating that due to the track of the storm, that we actually ended up putting out a flash flood emergency, something that's pretty rare, very rare. We put out a flash flood emergency for the Naples area due to this rapid increase in the water levels, and certainly occurred. But due to the fact that the storm just, the track was far enough east that that area avoided what could have really been a very devastating surge had it just been literally just a few miles offshore. So that concludes my part of the presentation. I guess I'll hand it off to our neighbors up the coast in Melbourne.
All right, we'll take it away here. Hi, my name is Matt Volkmer from the National Weather Service here in Melbourne. I'm the Science and Operations Officer, and today we're going to talk about some storm surge considerations for East Central Florida and some of the unique vulnerabilities in our area. As far as what we look at in the kind of the pre-season to pre-watch planning and readiness period, we're looking a lot at the slosh moms and meows. For this upcoming season, they'll be available again in HVX program online. It's Weather Service NEM community can access this data. And for East Central Florida, we will be accessing the North Florida basins, specifically for Volusia and Brevard counties, and then also South Florida basin, the Slosh Basin for Indian River, St. Lucie and Martin counties. And you can see in these images here, we've got a Cat 5 mom pictured scenario depicted where, so you can see the coastal areas have the highest surge vulnerability. And these slosh models are also available, excuse me, on the NOAA NHC and Storm Surge, National Storm Surge Hazard Map website that's also on this page. And next slide, please. I wanted to also kind of describe some of this National Hurricane Center Storm Surge watch and warning products and graphics that are available. This is an example of the first graphic here from Hurricane Matthew in 2006.
Matt?
Hi, this is Angie and Yeti in Jacksonville. Hey, good afternoon. I think we're going to move up the coast a little bit and then go back to Melbourne. So I'm one of the lead forecasters in Jacksonville, Florida, and Al Sandrick, who's the moderator of this call, is our warning coordination meteorologist. And our coastline is kind of taking into account a lot of things that were already discussed. We talked about the extended continental shelf across parts of the Gulf Coast region. We learned about areas in Mobile Bay where surge can actually be very high as we go inland in some of the riverfront estuary systems. And we have a lot of that here in the Jacksonville area. Our local Atlantic coastline is convex and basically a water catch basin for Atlantic tropical cyclones, with the center of that concavity very close to the mouth of a major river system we have here, the St. Johns River, which actually runs right through downtown Jacksonville. And in our series of slides here, we're going to showcase a difference in storm surge inundation heights between a northward tracking, or what we call a parallel moving storm that would be just offshore or very near our local coastline, and comparing that to realized inundation values for a landfalling or westward tracking Category 2 storm. And we downscaled our mapping to really showcase some vulnerable storm surge locations and infrastructure locations on the first coast for both of these aforementioned scenarios. In these first two graphics, we're going to focus on our large population center in our area of responsibility being Jacksonville, or Duval County, basically. So in our leftmost graphic here, we see potential storm surge inundation with a paralleling Category 2 storm. That would be a storm that's moving northward. And as a lot of other presenters showcased to you, we did utilize the new online HurrEvac HVX Meow Mixer interface, where you can really dial in on what storm surge could look like for a certain category and track and forward speed of a storm. So this is a really powerful tool to help you downscale what local impacts could look like. So in our first scenario there that we have on the left side, we could see the highest surge on the immediate ocean front, but we pretty much have limited rise as we extend inland in the St. Johns River Basin. And then if we compare that to our rightmost graphic, that's potential inundation with a landfalling hurricane on our local coastline. And that's a similar footprint to what we saw with our last direct hit from a hurricane, which was Dora back in 1964. We see much higher surge values along the immediate coastline with this scenario, but also extending inland, extending westward along that St. Johns River Basin estuary system, as well as in the intercoastal waterway there. And with this aerial overview of kind of Duval County footprint here, take a look at the geography of that St. Johns River Basin, especially as the river takes that southward bend heading towards downtown Jacksonville. It actually transitions into a more narrow corridor or choke point, if you will, and that can really focus a lot of water through a more narrow channel, bringing the threat of high surge values to important infrastructure locations in downtown Jacksonville. And we'll take a look at some of those here coming up. Next slide, please. Okay, so our first area that we dial in on here, getting a little closer in, is areas that are sensitive, marine sensitive areas, especially. And the first area I want to call your attention to is the U.S. Marine Corps on Blunt Island Command. And also that second area down there on the St. John's Basin, St. John's getting in downtown Jacksonville, is actually the Port of Jacksonville. We'll talk about each of these individually here. So as we are going to talk about Blunt Island first, this Marine Support Facility is actually the hub of the Marines Pre-Positioning Programs, and it supports global fleet Marine forces. So this is a really important military location in our area. And note that much of the command center would be inundated by a landfalling Cat 2 storm there on Blunt Island. As we take the river southward and hang a left there going into downtown Jacksonville, we focus on the Jacksonville Port area, and this is actually getting into that choke point of the river where the river basin actually really narrows down. And this port is actually the largest container port and one of the largest vehicle handling ports in the nation. So with far-reaching commerce impacts located here, the Port of Jax is certainly in a surge-prone location and is very susceptible to not just an extended duration of elevated water levels from potential surge, but also high currents as some of that water tries to flush out after the actual storm. Next slide, please. All right, so heading a little bit farther south in the St. John's Basin, heading just out of downtown Jacksonville, we arrive at some of the vulnerable healthcare facilities in our area. Focusing on the west bank of the river first is an area called Riverside in Jacksonville. This is where St. Vincent's Hospital is located. And then just on the other side of the river there on the east bank, we have several healthcare facilities, major healthcare facilities that include Baptist, Wolfson's, and Nemours medical centers. And actually some of the highest surge values that we could realize in our local area, regardless of storm size, track, intensity, forward speed, are actually located in part of this section of the St. Johns River Basin, and would absolutely be, devastating surge inundation values, not only in the healthcare facilities themselves, but also extended areas around entrance and egress points. One other note about our St. Johns River in Northeast Florida here is that surge water can actually become trapped in water within this section of the St. Johns, extending from downtown Jacksonville, pretty much southward towards like Putnam County, can actually slosh with tide cycles north to south. And this acts as something called a Seiche wave. So this basically means that the water inundation will tend to kind of shift north and south for days to possibly weeks post-storm, with a gradual dampening of those tidal levels as the river essentially flushes back out to the ocean. Next slide, please. All right, so we heard a little bit about this earlier from Jen in Tampa Bay, but we talked a little bit about how the storms themselves can actually reshape the coastlines, and especially some of our barrier islands. And we have an example here, a local example of how this tropical cyclones can modify our landscape, especially with areas that have barrier islands, like much of our Florida coast here. And this local example is an area of St. Johns County, just south of St. Augustine, but just north of Marineland. And this area is called Summer Haven. And this community is actually near the Matanzas Inlet. And on the graphic you see here, can you forward advance one? You should see a zoomed in area one more time for me, and a couple stars will appear. So that blue star that you see there is actually present day Matanzas Inlet. And then one more button there for me. In this area, the yellow star is what we're going to be talking about. This is an area back in the local history database called the Pinyon Inlet. So going back, after Hurricane Matthew in 2016, which was a northward moving paralleling storm, we had a quote unquote new inlet develop, which is indicated by the yellow star, which in fact was an older inlet, if we go back in the history books, called the El Pinyon Inlet. So note in some of these images that you see see there, the vulnerable structures, infrastructures there, very close to this Pinyon Inlet that had formed previously. And so, kind of a lesson here is that, these weak locations in our immediate coastline areas and on our barrier islands, that landscape will change, it will evolve. What maybe we appear as new present day was actually a weakened point back in the history books. So, keep abreast that this is not only the weather will change, but so could your actual coastline as well. Go forward to the next slide, please. Now here's the actual surge inundation for a Category 1 scenario that we had realized along portions of the coast there. And again, the yellow star and the blue stars in that middle graphic there indicate the Matanzas Inlet, as well as the old/new Pinyon Inlet. It's since closed up since Matthew. But just kind of a lesson here is that, knowing our local coastlines, especially barrier islands, will modify with tropical cyclone impacts. And knowing these vulnerable locations could help with mitigation efforts. So with that, I guess we'll throw it back to see if Melbourne wants to take it here. So let me transition back to Melbourne.
Okay, great. So we'll go to the next slide, Al. All right. Just going to go over, again, this was the potential storm surge flooding map from Hurricane Matthew and the storm surge watch warning graphic from Hurricane Dorian. So this, excuse me, the potential storm surge flooding map provides a risk assessment for decision makers looking at the reasonable worst case scenarios. And then the storm surge watch and the warnings provide, the possibility of life-threatening inundation within 48 hours for the watch, and then 36 hours as we get with the warning. And you can go to the next slide. Okay, I'm going to run you through a quick example here of a Cat 4 mom scenario for Volusia County and some of the considerations with that. So for the East Central Florida coast, the dunes are generally well developed along our barrier islands and can provide a natural barrier to significant storm surge risk with low-end tropical cyclones. But looking at a situation with a Cat 4 or higher for Volusia County, you can see that there'd be significant surge along the barrier islands, but also on the mainland areas of the county. And this is showing significant surge risk east of Nova Road on the mainland, which covers most of Daytona Beach. It's something that we typically don't think about as well, since major hurricanes happen not as frequently, is the surge risk across, inland areas that can occur along rivers and creeks and through inlets. The Cat 4 mom in this case in Volusia County shows surge along the Tomoka River and also the Spruce Creek that could potentially cover I-95 in one of these scenarios. So one additional point I'd like to make is we do have some large lakes across our inland areas. Lake Okeechobee, which has an earthen dam around it. If there were ever to be a breach of the dike, that would be handled locally with a flash flood warning. And for Lake George flooding, typically we would handle that with a river flood products and also flash flood warnings and aerial flood warnings. The tidal St. John's north of Lake George in Jacksonville's area is handled with some storm surge watch and warning products. And we'll go to the next slide. And I want to show you an example too of a Cat 3 mom scenario for the Martin County coast and the barrier islands there. And you can see in this scenario with the Cat 3 mom that there would be significant surge potential along the beachfront, but something we also don't maybe highlight as much as we can have significant riverfront flooding from the intercoastal areas. This scenario is showing a 6 to 8 foot AGL surge beachfront, but also 5 to 7 feet riverfront. So we have significant riverfront surge and intercoastal surge risks all along our barrier islands up into Brevard County, Merritt Island, Cocoa Isles area, and also into Volusia County as well. And we can go to the next slide. And wrapping up here, I'd like to take a look back at some East Central Florida historical surge impacts. This was Satellite Beach in 2004. Looking back at some of the pictures from that event, This season, we had 2 hurricane landfalls, onshore moving hurricanes, Francis, and then later, about 3 weeks later in September, Jeanne. And we had major dune erosion along the coast. You can see in the first picture, a coastal home completely undermined as the dunes were eroded. And the significant dune erosion loss we had in this event, increased the vulnerability of future storms. So the bottom line is we want to get the storm surge watches and warnings issued in enough time for people to take action, leave the coastal areas, and get people out of harm's way. And with that, I think I'm passing it off to the Florida Keys.
Yes, good afternoon. This is John Rizzo, Warning Coordination Meteorologist over at the National Weather Service in Key West. And my presentation is covering the Florida Keys storm surge and some lessons taught by, I would say, 3 teachers and an assistant teacher. These are lessons from the islands based on actual events. First, kind of a look around the bathymetry around the Florida Keys. Obviously, it's an archipelago of islands that extends off the South Florida coast roughly for about 110, 115 miles. Offshore on the ocean side, there is a reef. Obviously, nearly all the reef is submerged. However, it is shallow enough for one to go out and snorkel, for instance. And to do that 4 to 6 miles off your islands is quite impressive. And then the slope gets deep rather quickly. However, there's a lot of mythology about the reef protecting the Keys from storm surge. And while it does break up the very large swells that you see out in the open ocean, the reef can create a little more problem for storms that are coming in off the Atlantic side. And as you see with some other presentations, we have a very shallow slope on our north side, the Gulf of Mexico, and of course the Florida Bay region, which pound for pound, inch for inch, can produce a larger surge in height, although yet with perhaps less damaging winds. Let's move on right ahead to the Labor Day hurricane slide. A very traditional, a very simplified strike on the Florida Keys, not quite completely perpendicular, but of course being one of the strongest storms, being the strongest storm to hit the US mainland, with sustained winds roughly about 185 miles per hour, but yet a very small compact storm. In the diagram on the right side of the screen, I have kind of shaded in a kind of a pink shading the actual area or extent of sustained hurricane force winds. On the left-hand side of that inset there is actually Big Pine Key. So we're not even looking at Key West in there, a very small diameter storm. And obviously on the ocean side, it was a very large surge. The maximum inundation that's predicted by slosh meow of a west-northwest or northwest moving storm of category 5 strength is roughly just over 9 feet above ground level. However, we do know from reports that the water levels were up to 15 feet above ground level with wave wash marks that would have exceeded 20 feet over the Keys. What's happening there is that over time that we get a wave setup and also an additional wave run up that occurs inside the reef. When you think about it, hurricane force winds blowing from the deep water into the shallower waters of Hawk Channel inside the reef are going to pile up water over time. And then given hurricane force winds, the water is not readily able to escape. And in the areas of the middle and upper Keys, you have long islands with small breaks in there. Once you get past Long Key, then you get very large breaks. And so it's very hard for the water to get over to the bayside without climbing over the land. And of course, the devastation is well noted in historical photographs, including scouring all the way down off the topsoil layer and into the coral marl on top. Going to the next slide. With Hurricane Wilma, it was a story of 2 surges. Hurricane Wilma was a major hurricane that passed well to the northwest of Key West on a southwest to northeast track. Therefore, the core and the eye wall stayed off the Keys, but passed to the west. This allowed the strongest winds to push water initially on the ocean side, and we had a very shallow flooding of 1 to 2 feet above ground level, mainly down in Key West on the ocean side. But then as the storm passed a beam to the north of Key West, the wind shifted more out of a southwest to west direction and pushed water up into Florida Bay to the north of the islands. Now, what happened here that was very striking about this event was that the acceleration of Wilma into the mainland allowed that piling up of water to lag behind by several hours. And in fact, the peak surge occurred on the Gulf and Bay side, about 2 to 5 feet generally above ground level, well after the winds had decreased below hurricane force, and there were basically minimal tropical storm force due to the decaying structure along the south and west side of Wilma. It actually stopped raining, and that's when the peak water came in. So the lesson learned from Wilma was that not in every case is the maximum height of water going to occur while the winds are at their worst and people are naturally indoors. In fact, people were coming outside, and as you can see with some of the photographs there, obviously there's no travel at all. And actually that was probably part of the most dangerous part of the storm. Moving on to the next slide. With Hurricane Irma, we had a general oceanside storm surge of 3 to 7 feet above ground level near and to the right of where Irma made landfall. And obviously with the added impact of very large battering waves that occurred on the ocean side. However, even though Irma's south side wasn't very well formed by that point after tangling with the coast of Cuba, there actually was still a decent amount of westerly to southwesterly tropical storm force winds that occurred several hours after Irma passed the lower Keys. And this caused a kind of a secondary surge. But unlike Wilma, the secondary surge was actually much less than the primary surge that occurred on the ocean side earlier in the day. However, because of the devastation of a Category 4 hurricane and the large surge throughout the middle and lower Keys especially, no power and other things, this was very disconcerting. And actually, Emergency Management Director Marty Centerfit at the time, serving during Hurricane Irma, had brought up an interesting point in messaging, and that was after you get a primary surge like that is devastating, there is no such thing as a minor surge after that. So while I'm using the term here, just an explanation, actually in the real event, anytime the water climbs over your mean higher mark and causes flooding, it's just surge at that point. And so we made sure that we took out the word minor and actually refer to it as just that a secondary storm surge will occur on the bay side. Thankfully, not very large. Had Irma missed Cuba and moved on and had a very well second side on there, we would have been looking at a devastating secondary surge following the departure of the maximum winds in the Florida Keys. And finally, I mentioned the teaching assistant at the last slide. Hurricane Eta had not made hurricane strength yet on its first approach to the Florida Keys, but due to its very asymmetric structure, the center itself kind of went over the Long Key Marathon area. However, much of the weather extended well to the east. And with these asymmetric storms, where the wind is blowing tends to be where the water is piling up the most. And in my saying here, where there's a bay, there's a way. When you have the confined waters of not just Florida Bay, but the intricate sounds that form the eastern end of it, much shallower water, the water piled up and actually produced some storm surge flooding actually during that time. And most of that was limited to the upper Keys. And even so, I have a picture there showing the scouring that occurred on the roadbed of US Highway 1 there. It actually took out about 3,000 feet of chain link fence up and down that most vulnerable southern side there. So even though wasn't a hurricane at the time, just knowing where those bands are and providing that information, we can tell that that's where the highest level of the water is. This is the value of your local National Weather Service office. The Hurricane Center is so good. The Storm Surge Unit and Jamie Rome and all the folks there are very good at trying to get the prediction of a reasonable worst case potential surge. However, at the local level, this is where we provide a lot more shading, including the timing as well as the localization of it, as you've heard from all the great presentations we just heard. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Al.
Actually, I'll go ahead and take that. This is Dan Noah from the Weather Service in Tampa. And we are, there we go. Let's try that. Okay, we are going to switch it over and send it over to Amy Godsey. Amy is the state meteorologist for the Florida Division of Emergency Management. Go ahead, Amy.
All right, thanks, Dan. Just want to make sure everyone can see my screen okay. Okay, great. All right. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk. Again, I'm Amy Godsley. I'm the Chief Meteorologist with the Florida Division of Emergency Management. And I really appreciate all the information just shared by all of our National Weather Service offices in Florida. And as you've seen, each region has its challenges related to storm surge impacts. Thus, emergency managers have challenges related to evacuation decisions. And so I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about our regional evacuation studies in Florida and some of the new things that you'll see for 2021 for our counties. We are in the process of completing a full restudy of all 10 regional planning council areas in Florida, and that will project evacuation needs and sheltering needs through the year 2025. So a few things that you'll see new in 2021 with these evacuation studies is some behavioral information. We're taking anonymous cell phone tracking data from the last 7 hurricanes that required an evacuation in Florida, just to give a better behavioral analysis, some more data as to how people respond and think to storm surge threats and impacts to Florida. And that will either be in terms of direct evacuations because they were ordered to, or what we call shadow evacuations, where they were not necessarily in an evacuation zone, but chose to evacuate anyways. And those are just some additional tools that emergency managers can use in terms of their evacuation decision trees when a hurricane starts to become a threat to Florida. And I'll just quickly go through some of these slides while I talk. If you were on our Monday presentation, you may have heard Director Guthrie talk about leveraging technology. And so again, we are going to be leveraging technology with our evacuation studies. Really, as far as evacuation studies have gone back decades in Florida, and the emergency managers were given large boxes of 3- and 4-inch binders given with all these evacuation study information. And so it was a lot of information to try to sift through. We moved to CD-ROMs, but now we're going to go digital. We want to be interactive. We want to make sure that evacuation study information is usable, user-friendly to the emergency manager, and also readily accessible for them to use in evacuation decisions. So these will be interactive and posted on the division SharePoint portal, and also making a GIS portal in terms of our graphical information that we put into these studies. The PDFs on the SharePoint will provide some contextual information that you will find in the data tables and the GIS portal, but it really will help you get a little bit more granularity. Typically, you would see just a county evacuation model versus a regional one. This may allow you to do a smaller granular section of maybe contiguous counties. We know all of our regions are large, they have different challenges, and so you may want to look at a smaller subset. We've noticed that not every region of Florida evacuates the same way or has the same decision model, but maybe smaller sets of contiguous counties do have a similar behavioral and evacuation model. So again, this will allow a little bit more extra level of detail for emergency managers to utilize when they're going through their planning processes in advance of a hurricane threat. All of this information will be formally rolled out and online by June 30th, 2021. So hopefully we won't have a hurricane impact before that time. I just jinxed everyone, so I apologize for that. But again, if there were to be a threat to Florida, certainly this information could be shared in advance of a storm threat. But it will be a formally rolled out process at the end of June, and those updates will also be sent to HUREVAC, the developers of HUREVAC. So for those of you who use HVX, again, those clearance timetables, any changes to county evacuation zones will be shared and imported into HVX for this season to use. Now, HVX is a great tool. You've seen that in some of the presentations. We want to continue to encourage emergency managers to utilize this information. We utilize it every day during a storm impact in the state EOC. And again, some of the great benefits to that, and this may not be usable for every storm scenario, but the ability to overlay potential storm surge inundation forecasts from the National Hurricane Center over county evacuation zone maps could be a good tool if you're in a pinch situation for county emergency managers. So any information that you need, Andrew Sussman is our our state hurricane program planner. And of course, you can also reach out to your regional planning council for any questions or additional additional details related to the evacuation studies. But again, we want to make sure that emergency managers across the state have the tools right at their fingertips. Again, another tool in the toolbox, but also user-friendly and in as much of a consolidated place as possible so that they can make fast and effective evacuation decisions. So I appreciate the time, and I'll turn it back over to Dan.
All right, thank you, Amy. So when you answer the question, please turn on your webcam. We're just going to read a couple of questions